Well, Douglas Murray is the author of 7 books, including The War on the West and The Strange Death of Europe. He joins Rita every week and he's with me now. Douglas, perhaps the most important speech given anywhere in the world this week came from UK Home Secretary Suella Braverman. She told an audience in Washington that the migrant crisis currently facing the Western world is a result of outdated human rights laws. Have a listen.
Who we allow to come into our country and become one of us is a fundamental issue. Without public consent, immigration is illegitimate. Dismissing as idiots or bigots those members of the public who express legitimate concerns is not merely unfair, it is dangerous. Europe is at a critical juncture. The EU must find a way to meet the challenge of illegal migration, because failure to do so I fear, undermine the legitimacy of democratic institutions and create the conditions for more extreme politics.
Douglas, it was a great speech. She went on to argue that the United Nations Refugee Convention, set up after the Second World War, is completely outdated and needs to be overhauled if the crisis is ever to end. Is she right, and why?
She's absolutely right. And thank goodness a prominent politician in a leading democracy has actually finally said this. Australia led the way in this 10 years ago under the Abbott government, when it famously, as everyone watching knows, started the turn around the boats policy. But Australia is very unusual in being a country that's, first of all, of course, geographically much more isolated than many other countries in the world. And secondly, actually having had governments that wanted to protect and defend the country's borders. But of course, Europe and Britain and America are in a totally different situation today. That millions and millions, literally hundreds of millions of people in sub-Saharan Africa alone wish to move to Europe. And we see the consequences of this every week. And the reality is that Europe cannot take them in. It's the same with people flooding across the southern border of the United States. And the thing that Suella Braverman was so brave to address was to say, look, everybody knows this is the case. Every democracy is going through this problem in some form. And the problem is that we are living with an outdated system. The UN Convention set up after World War II, first of all, it insisted that you prioritize people who actually had legitimate asylum claims, not people who simply had less of a good standard of living than we do in the West, not simply that you had a fear of potential persecution somewhere down the road, but a real persecution going on. The second thing is, we now live in a world where ease of movement means that you can get from Venezuela to New York City in not very much time at all. And the third thing is, of course, smartphones, cell phones have changed everything. Everyone can communicate and see what the rest of the world is like, and much of the developing world wants to move to the developed world, and the developed world realistically just cannot take them. And that was what Braverman was pointing to this week. I'm delighted she did point to it, and it's about time.
The Home Secretary has also claimed that people are gaming the system to gain asylum in Britain. Specifically, she said some are pretending to be gay. Here's what she said.
What we see operationally is that people do game the system. They come to the UK, they purport to be homosexual in the effort to game our system, in the effort to get special treatment. That's not fair, and it's not right. Really.
Now, Douglas, ITV News political editor Robert Peston tweeted that the PM should distance himself from those comments. What are your thoughts?
I mean, that is such a journalistic game, isn't it, doing that? I mean, Robert Peston is really just playing a political activist role at this stage. The Home Secretary gives a speech, makes a perfectly valid point in an interview, and immediately the low-grade interviewer in question decides to try to make another news story by claiming there's clear water between the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary when there isn't. The other thing is, people like Peston, the interviewer there, genuinely seem to know nothing about what is actually happening. I've traveled to the countries people are fleeing from, and I've traveled all across the countries that people are fleeing to. And I can say with absolute certainty, because I've seen it myself, there are many people who game the system or try to game the system by pretending to be gay when they're not. That isn't to say that there aren't gay people who are fleeing persecution. Likewise, there are many people, particularly from the Middle East, who have claimed in recent years when they enter Europe that they are Christians when they are in fact Muslims. I've met people doing this myself in suburbs of Germany and refugee camps. I've seen people who have been taught these are the things you say if you want to get asylum. I don't understand why so many left-wing journalists who are so uninterested in this subject are genuinely amazed that people would cross a continent and then fib about something. It's not to say that everyone's a liar. It's saying, of course, you are going to have people gaming the system. And the Home Secretary is saying, oh, do we want to be the mugs here? Or do we want to face up to these realities? She wants to face up to the realities, but plenty of these activist left-wing journalists simply don't.
Douglas, while we've got a migration crisis everywhere in the Western world, corruption's pretty endemic as well. In Australia, we occasionally have politicians accused of corruption. Famously, we had a New South Wales state premier resign, not because he was corrupt, but because the Independent Commission Against Corruption found he'd failed to declare that he'd been given a bottle of wine. So that was the end of his career. But Americans, when they do something, they go big. Tell us about Democrat Senator Robert Menendez, who's just been indicted on bribery charges. It's quite an extraordinary story.
It is an amazing story. Senator Menendez, longtime senator, and he was raided last week. I wrote about this in The Spectator this week. His house was raided by law enforcement who found almost $500,000 in cash packed into jacket pockets and closets in his house. They also found, I think, something like 13 bars of gold. Now, the bars of gold appear to have been given to the senator by some Egyptian businessmen. And just to make the matter even worse and more humiliating, the law enforcement also found on Menendez's computer that he'd Google searched the price of a bar of gold. So it's a really humiliating thing for him. But it's an astonishing story for several reasons. One is, of course, Menendez is trying to claim innocence. He claims that he has routinely for many years transferred money from his bank account into cash and kept it in his house. And he said it's because of his Cuban family's record of having things confiscated. Now, Menendez was not born in Cuba. And in any case, if you feared having your cash confiscated, it's much more likely to be confiscated if you're leaving it in huge piles in your house. And that form of confiscation is known as burglary. And it's much more common in New Jersey, where the senator lives, than Cuban-style coups. So I'm not sure how many people are buying the excuse, but it is a sign of something that I've written about before and that Rita and I have talked about, which is there is a level of corruption at the top of American politics, which really does shame the world's leading democracy. You've just given that example of a rather pitiful example of an Australian politician. I would raise you a British politician who had to apply to one of the committees and seek forgiveness because he hadn't declared a trip to Warsaw paid for by the British Council. And I love this idea that anyone can honestly argue that people go into British politics just to enrich themselves, when in fact the best thing you can get is a weekend trip to Poland. But the point is that actually it is very important to keep anti-corruption at the center of democratic politics. You do in Australia, we do, I think, in Britain, but in America, I mean, we're talking about a country where the former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, has managed to increase her wealth by $140 million since the financial crisis of 2008. I submit to you that what is called insider trading on Wall Street and is illegal seems not to be illegal when it happens in the House. And I think that Americans and American democracy as a whole really needs to think about this. It's some banana republic things you see in America these days, and if Menendez can get through this and actually get off, I'd be very surprised. I'm very pleased he's been found.
Douglas, I want to ask you about Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. I think you'd agree they seem fairly image conscious. Well, a new report shows the lengths to which they're prepared to go in order to ensure they're portrayed in the best possible light. When the pair visited a public school in Harlem back in 2021, it's now emerged they tried to gag staff and students from making any negative comments about them on social media now or in the future. So prior to the school visit, where Meghan read to children and Prince Harry sat among them, the couple's management team asked the school to sign legal documents that would prevent them from ever saying anything negative about them. Now, I'm not a celebrity, let alone a royal, but is this normal behaviour?
It's not normal behavior. Most people, if they visit a school and read a storybook to children, don't say, and if you say anything nasty, I'll sue you. That seems to be the Sussex's modus operandi. It's not common. Most people, among other things, do good works and just sort of hope that they do good works for the sake of the good works, not simply to sort of just get a PR trip out of it. It's another example of the extraordinary litigiousness and the fragility of this couple. The litigiousness of the Sussexes is quite extraordinary. They're repeatedly suing newspapers. They seem to have decided it's their life mission, a suicide mission, as the King pointed out, to try to destroy the press. But to be coming after school teachers and kids as well, that's an especially bad look.
Douglas, just before we go, the Scottish Ballet is retelling the Cinderella story, but with a twist. Cinderella will, of course, be a man. In their version of the classic fairy tale, a bloke named Cinders will be rescued from a life of drudgery by his princess. The ballet boasts that their break with tradition is a world first, and they can't wait to share it with audiences. Is it really something to boast about, and do you think audiences will be impressed?
Yeah, New York City Ballet did this a few years ago as well. They always sort of want to do this sort of gender reversal stuff and have these extremely daring things like a couple of men dancing together. And I think that the companies that do this misunderstand both the art form of ballet and the audiences who attend. I don't think that anyone believes that the world of ballet dancing is a rapaciously heterosexual, heteronormative art form. And I would suggest that gender bending and much more is more commonplace in ballet than the people running the ballet companies seem to know. So yes, it might be newsworthy if it happened on, I don't know, a rugby field. I don't think it's the most groundbreaking thing to have a male Cinders.
Douglas Murray, thanks so much for joining me tonight.
Great pleasure.